Hello, friends, and welcome to Fragile Gnomes, Episode 2. I'm Dave Jones, your host and creator of Fragile Gnomes. Here at Fragile Gnomes, we discuss everything from life experiences on paranormal, spiritual, and the unexplained, as well as trying to get weekly paranormal stories out to you, the listeners, from myself and from other people giving us their first-hand experience. Today's show is about my experience as an apprentice at one of the local funeral homes near me. Fragile Gnomes is about being open-minded and understanding that we don't have all the answers to all the mysteries out there, but not being afraid to step out of the garden walls and seeing what's on the other side. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy. The real names of the funeral home and people I'm about to tell you about have been changed for privacy reasons as well as respect for the people that reside there. I was a young mortuary student going to school and working 2 jobs to make ends meet. One of the jobs was a position as a new apprentice for a respected funeral home near me. I had been working at the funeral home for a couple of months, and I was really getting to know the place and the culture of the people working there. There were some subtle and some not so subtle remarks made suggesting that the funeral home may in fact be haunted. My coworkers would make light humor to the fact that I hadn't seen anything paranormal yet. It seemed like a rite of passage for the funeral directors and staff working there, at least for the ones that still did. They would make comments like, "Let's see how long he can last when he has to close for the first time." I thought to myself sarcastically, "Can't wait." It was around 9:30 at night on my first night closing when the last family member left, giving us the green light to start closing things down and locking up. I remember going down the long hallway all the way to the end, then to the left and back up to the front of the funeral home where it led out into a visitation room. Each visitation room had back doors for us to move in and out of so we could move bodies and flowers discreetly. Every night we would move all the bodies from the visitation rooms back to the prep room and then secure all the doors in the funeral home. There were 6 visitation rooms and 1 chapel that had to be closed and secured. The only time we left a casket in the chapel was for an early funeral service the following morning. Each door to a visitation room had a motion sensor on it that ran a feedback to the security system located in the back of the funeral home. The panel had lights for all 12 doors being monitored. If the light was green, the room was secured. If the light was red, that meant you had to go back and close the door. After finishing my rounds of securing the funeral home, myself as well as 3 of my co-workers gathered by the back door to set the alarm to leave. The manager walked over and said, "Are we all ready?" To which we all confirmed that we were good to go. As he got ready to put in the code, he paused and said, "Well, it looks like we missed a door." Glancing at my colleagues to see if anyone looked like they missed one, I watched 2 more lights turn red and then another. I looked at everyone anxiously with a total loss for words. One of the funeral directors said, "Well, it looks like it's going to be one of those nights." "What kind of night is that?" He turned and said, "This happens from time to time. We sometimes have to shut the doors 2 or even 3 times before we can turn the alarm system on, and then the alarm almost always goes off within an hour of us leaving." Then one of the directors said, "Whoever's on call has to come back here and go through the whole process again." I thought to myself, this is crazy. Who would do that after just seeing all the doors open when we had just closed them? "Well, let's get started," he said. Everyone scattered in different directions to lock up all the doors again. As we finished for the second time gathering around the back door to set the alarm, it all started again. The lights go back to red as if we never closed them. I thought, can this really be happening with all these people witnessing it? Could someone be playing a prank on us? Am I in a legitimate haunted funeral home? I knew that it couldn't be a prank because with the exception of the security guard outside, we were the only ones there. After 3 attempts to lock up the funeral home, we finally got the doors to stay green long enough to set the alarm and head out the door. 3 of the funeral directors went straight to their cars, but as I was on my way to mine, Tom motioned for me to come over to his truck. I decided to stay with Tom and see if I could get any more explanations as to what just happened. Tom opened his tailgate, took off his coat, jumped up, and sat down. We started talking through the events that had just taken place as he was filling me in on some of the past occurrences, such as water faucets turning on by themselves, chairs being moved by themselves, and even flowers spread around the funeral home from visitation rooms. Tom started to tell me his theory on what was happening so regularly at the funeral home, but was interrupted by the security guard pulling up, blinding us with her headlights as she turned around. She had been making her rounds in the cemetery that was all around the funeral home. It was one of those few funeral home cemetery combos left in the city. She drove up to the back of the chapel and backed up to the windows. She got out of the truck and popped the tailgate. Then she proceeded to get out a TV VCR combo from her truck and set it up on the tailgate facing the chapel window. I looked at Tom and said, "What is she doing?" "I have no idea. Let's go ask her." We walked over to the security guard and we both exchanged polite hellos. I then said, "Wouldn't it be easier if you pulled up a little so that you have room to put a chair in front of the TV?" Much to our surprise, her response was that it wasn't for her to watch. She said the manager had already called her and said that the doors in the funeral home were opening again and that it might be one of those nights. "What does that mean? What's the TV for?" She looked at me and then paused.
"I put the TV there facing the window with the cartoons for the little girl that I've seen in the funeral home. If I put the TV on, she won't make the alarm go off all night long. She likes to watch cartoons."
"Have you seen her?"
"Of course I have. You don't think I'd put the TV on for an imaginary friend, do you?"
I could not believe what I was hearing. It was all really overwhelming, yet slightly exciting that everyone has experienced something here. She told me that if I had not seen her, that I should count my blessings. This would later make a lot more sense to me. A few days had passed and I had been processing what had happened my first night closing, knowing that I had another night coming up. I had a friend who was also a student with me in the mortuary school, and he too worked at the funeral home that I did. He had heard what had happened, and he had to close that night. He told me that he was dreading it, and so far he has had to close 3 times, but nothing happened yet. I reassured him that what had happened was odd and definitely a little creepy, but that he should be okay. The next day at school, Adam didn't show up. I had finished up my school lab and went to lunch and then headed to work. When I had arrived at work, I did see Adam, but he wasn't in a suit. He was standing at the back door and he shook the manager's hand and started walking my way. I walked over to him and said, "Hey Adam, what's going on?" He said that he had just quit and that if I was smart, I would do the same thing. I said, "Really? What happened? Why did you quit?" He looked at me and asked, "You remember that I closed last night, right?" I said, "Yeah, I know you were a little timid. Did something happen?" "Oh man, something happened, didn't it?" "Yeah, something did happen, and I can't bring myself to work here anymore." He said that he was closing down the chapel and going through the church pews to pick up any tissue that were left behind. When he got to the 3rd row, all of the church pews kneelers started falling down one by one. The kneelers are what you pull down from the bench in front of you that allows you to kneel during a Catholic service. They started falling like dominoes, which shouldn't happen because they are not connected. By the time it got to him, which only took a few seconds, something physically picked him up and threw him over the next pew. He jumped up and ran out the room and yelled for help. The manager was just outside the chapel and had heard the kneelers falling and then the sound of him falling. Adam could tell that I was bothered by what he was telling me, partly because my jaw was hanging down and the fact that I was completely speechless. "I can deal with creepy pictures and scary sounds," Adam said. "But when something can physically touch me and knock me off my feet, I'm not safe, and it's not worth any amount of money." He wished me good luck and insisted that I consider leaving as well. Fortunately, that night went smoothly and nothing paranormal happened. I thought about quitting, but it wasn't easy getting the funeral home gig in the same town as a mortuary school because of supply and demand. So I decided to stay, and everything seemed to calm down for a little while. A few weeks later, I had a crazy nightmare. In my dream, I was working at the funeral home, but for some reason, my small dog Sammy was with me. The manager was a huge dog lover, and he always encouraged us to bring our dogs to work to meet everyone. I was in the back hallway with Sammy when suddenly she slipped loose from her collar at the end of the leash. She started running down the hallway and into the side chapel door that was open. I started jogging down the hallway because I didn't know if there was any family members in there paying their last respects. When I got in the chapel, I could see that no one was in there, but I could see Sammy by the pews. She was sniffing at something and then she started walking under them. I went a few down from where I thought she was heading, and I got on my hands and knees to get her. When I got down to take a look, I was greeted by a little girl that quickly grabbed Sammy and pulled her towards her. Startled, I jumped back and started running out of the chapel and down the hall straight for the side door that exited the funeral home. I pushed the door open and ran outside in the cemetery away from the door. I turned to look behind me, expecting to see the girl chasing me. To my satisfaction, she wasn't. As I turned around, there she was, standing in front of me only feet away. She said, "Why doesn't anyone play with me? Why does everyone ignore me?" I took notice to how she was holding her arms down and her fingernails seemed to be growing. She looked at me, getting angrier. I looked at her and said, "What are you doing here? Who are you? Why are you here? I don't think you're supposed to be here. You're dead." She let out a loud scream and started swinging her arms towards me, clawing at me. I knew any minute I was going to feel the pain in my skin being scratched off my face. I was suddenly woken up from my nightmare. My girlfriend was shaking me and telling me to wake up. When I came to, she said that I was having a bad dream and talking to someone. She then paused and said, "What's wrong with your face?" I immediately turned the light on. "Oh my God, you have a huge scratch on your face and you're bleeding." Immediately I remembered my dream and how I was about to get scratched by the dead girl in my nightmare. I started panicking and told her my dream. I think that it was a scratch by the ghost girl in my funeral home. I went to work the following day and told the manager that I was considering leaving, that too many unexplainable things were happening. He said he understands, but if I could wait a week or so, they might have a solution to the problem going on in the funeral home. How could they possibly have a solution? He told me that the owners had hired a paranormal team to do an investigation, and that if they could catch enough evidence, that the church agreed to do an exorcism on the funeral home. I had never heard of the church doing an exorcism on buildings or properties. Why did they think this would work? The manager was confident that they would gather enough evidence to get the approval. I decided to see where this was all going and to see what, if anything, could be documented. 3 days later, the paranormal investigation showed up and set up their equipment, and the investigation began. They spent 4 nights collecting evidence, and they did get evidence. The footage they got was a little girl apparition appearing on the camera while she was walking down the aisle of the chapel. The footage was so good that they could make out her clothes and hairstyle. All the investigators agreed that it looked as if she was going through the motions of walking a pet. They also got an EVP recording with the responses to their questions. They got a name. During the investigation, they looked into the name that they got on the EVP, and then they had a lead. They discovered that 2 years before, the funeral home had served a family of a little girl that had the same name as on the recording. She was walking her dog in front of her house, and then the dog escaped from the collar and ran out into the street. When the little girl went out into the street to get her dog, she was struck by a car with an elderly gentleman driving that didn't even see her. On top of that, she was buried right next to the funeral home, only 60 yards away from the side door I had ran out of in my dream. The same place I had my encounter with the ghost girl who scratched me on the face. I decided I wasn't going to wait to see if the exorcism got approved. I was finished working at the funeral home. I put in my notice and stayed the remaining 2 weeks. Some years later, the funeral home was torn down and a new funeral home was built outside of the cemetery on the opposite side. The exorcism of the property didn't work. My friend Adam, that had quit the funeral home, also quit the funeral business altogether. He later became a minister. I want to thank you for taking the time and listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you like the story, please hit the like button and subscribe so that you can get the latest shows from Fragile Gnome. If you have a story that you would like to share, please let me know in the comments, or you can send me an email to the address listed in the description box. Again, thank you for watching this show, and I hope you enjoy future episodes to come.